Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and for also viewing the recording when you get hold of it. So, we are going to have a really fascinating discussion today with Dr. Kathy Connor. I'm sure that many people have heard of her and they might know her as Dr. Kathy Murphy. She's so important, she has various names. So, we're trying to, in this discussion, focus on the brain side of what's happening for dogs when either they're engaging their senses or if we actually give them sensory opportunities. And why that's really important for their well-being, why dogs have this essential need. So, for those of you that have either read my book or know about my book, you'll know that I really wrote that as a plea to let's look a little more closely at who our dogs actually are. Um, to notice their abilities, their emotions, and their sensory world, not just in terms of what how we can harness that and what they can do for us, but just how that actually forms their world. We talk a lot about dogs being in our world and having to adjust to our world. And it does seem, well, it is quite human centric, isn't it? It's all about how should they adapt to living with us. And yet they have their own world and they have their own opportunities that they look for. And of course, we know that in the UK anyway, there are lots and lots of very, very stressed dogs. There's lots and lots of issues with challenging behavior. So we want to look at what we can do to actually make our dogs' worlds a bit of a happier place, or at the very least, start to understand them a wee bit more clearly. So I have some questions lined up that I think would be really interesting, but these are just guide questions and we'll probably, venture off a couple of times. So, Kathy, can you explain in a way that we will all understand and don't have to be neuroscientists, just what exactly is happening neurologically when a dog is receiving that sensory information? They see something, they hear something, they taste or they touch. What is going on underneath the bonnet that we can't see?
So I guess one way to think about the nervous system is that you've got the brain, which currently we think of as the center of the nervous system. We might come on to microbiome and the gut being the second brain at some point. But for now, the brain is kind of the center of the nervous system. And then connected to the brain, we have all of these different nerves that bring information from different parts of the body. Some of the sensory information comes relatively directly to the brain. So we've got visual stimuli from the eyes that is taken, if I go here, that's taken all the way to the back of the brain, to the part of the brain that processes visual information before those signals then integrate with other parts of the brain. And similarly, auditory stimuli, so what the dog is hearing, it actually wires straight through to an area of the brain that's just right underneath the ears on either side. And that area, the temporal lobe, is responsible for receiving those signals and then passing them on to be integrated. But we've obviously got very long neurons. So if we take the neurons on the tips of my fingers, which would be the equivalent of the toes of the dog, those signals have to travel not up one neuron, but up several neurons because there are junctions along the way, but particularly in the spinal cord, for instance. So those are really long nerves, and then they jump over to signals in other nerves, particularly in the spinal cord in the example I'm using, before those signals then reach the brain areas that are going to process them. And in the case of the motor system, we've got areas up here on the brain that process the motor signals. And then we've got tactile stimulation and pain. Tactile stimulation is actually really interesting if we just focus on that for a minute, because there's a lot of information that dogs pick up through their pads as they're walking. So they can pick up not only what the temperature of the surface is, but how knobbly it is, so what it feels like underfoot, how slippery it is, because if they're on a slippery surface, then obviously they need to tense their muscles differently to hold their frame to stop them slipping over, and they need that information before they slip. And they obviously also have pain receptors there that can tell them whether something is painful, but also can give them information about how their limbs are moving. So, how their feet are moving over the surface, which direction their limbs are moving in. So, the proprioception, if you like, where their limbs are in space. And then all of that information is not only coming from the feet, but they're receiving information about how the wind flutters through their fur, for instance, or what the temperature is on the fur on different areas of their body. And that's all, again, going into those nerves and being funneled back to the brain, along with it's then being integrated with all of the other sensory information. Um, and all of the tactile information, the movements, so the proprioception, the temperature information, pain information, that's all being funneled into a relatively small, what we would call a gate, just because it is like a gate. It's where all the paths converge, if you like, at the base of the brain where the thalamus is. And that gate at the base of the brain is then going to decide which information to prioritize. So usually if there's pain information coming through, that would be prioritized in the first instance. So the dog may not consciously process what the temperature is or which direction the wind's blowing in if it's just trodden on a piece of Lego, which is about the most painful thing I can think of. But if it's walking over a surface that is painful for quite a long time and it knows it has to get to the other side anyway, processing those pain signals as a priority long term is not going to be beneficial. So then the thalamus may actually downgrade those signals and take the other signals like the wind speed and direction, the temperature, the other tactile information, and upgrade that. So there's already, before that information reaches the brain, quite a bit of processing in terms of which signals are going to be prioritized for processing, are going to go straight to the conscious parts of the brain, so that they're going to be brought to attention of the conscious parts of the brain. And similarly, those processes go on for visual information at the back of the brain and auditory information on the side. And then we haven't talked about taste and olfaction. But for dogs and for some other species, that's probably the most, or definitely one of the most important senses. And olfaction is a little bit different in dogs, as far as we know, to other species, in that there are quite a few anatomical differences to their olfactory system that enable them to automatically prioritize olfactory information. So their world is very olfactory. We don't really understand necessarily what that's like, because ours is kind of the opposite. We tend to process visual stimuli to a very high degree and not be as conscious of the olfactory information. But if we think about just the fact that the olfactory information, so they breathe in, they have receptors in the nose that will detect various different smells. For dogs, they have a higher concentration of receptors than humans have. They also have more ability to distinguish or identify smells through those receptors than we have. We kind of tend to have good smell, bad smell, smells a bit like this, smells a bit like that, whereas they will have much more granular processing of the information at that level. And those signals from the olfactory system pass straight through to the brain, actually through holes in the skull. This is in humans as well as dogs, to an area of the brain that sits just behind there called the olfactory bulb, which has really direct connections with other parts of the brain that decide what to think about the smell and to decide what to feel about the smell. And those direct connections exist in humans as well, but they're just not as strong. So they're not as well trodden, they're not as thick. So, literally the millimeter thickness of those tracks is not as big, whereas in dogs it's much bigger. And then one important thing, which is, as far as we know, is different in dogs to other species, is that they have really strong structural nerve tracts that run from that area at the front where the olfactory stimuli are coming in, the front of the brain, all the way to the back of the brain, where we process visual stimuli, where dogs also process visual stimuli, but where we now think they are also processing olfactory stimuli. And if you look at human brains, they don't have those thick tracts that go straight from the olfactory system all the way back to the occipital area. We don't necessarily know what the impact of those tracks are on the dog's experience. Some people say it proves that dogs can see scent, so they actually they have a visual representation of scent. I kind of resist that, but that's only because it doesn't necessarily make sense to me, but it's possible. So that's just my own bias. But it's also possible that it allows for a greater level of accurate integration with visual stimuli. Also, this area, the occipital ridge at the back here, is right over the cerebellum and is close to the motor cortex. So it's possible, I have no scientific evidence for this, but this is just another theory that's out there. It's possible that shuttling the olfactory signals all the way to the back of the brain enables the dog to be able to have a motor response that is much quicker and much more accurate, and perhaps integrate with those areas at the back of the brain that are all to do with where am I in space, which direction am I going in, how quickly am I going to go there. So that's a possibility, is that it changes the way that those signals are processed. But that's going to be fascinating to watch how the research delves into that and how we start to see when those tracks are active and when they're not, and what that might mean for the integration of olfactory information. Now, I haven't finished telling you all of the stuff that's exciting, but I probably should pause for breath so we can go over any of that information and go through it again if we want to slow
Well,
down.
it's interesting you were saying that about scent. And sight, and thinking about those different structures, because we do know, don't we, that dogs' eyesight is different from humans, and they see a more limited range of colours,
Yeah.
but they're very, very attuned to movement.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because, I suppose in one way, thinking about there's so much information coming through their sense of smell, and possibly more limited information coming, from
Yeah.
sight. That kind of our vision of, like, I was trying to think there, there are people that have got, is it synesthesia,
Yeah.
where they taste certain words, or certain words have colors, or whatever. And that's interesting. But again, that's us trying to imagine with our eyesight
Yes.
how we would see a smell. And again, that's the problem, isn't it? That, because we're imagining from the human point of view. Um, and so that takes us down in a different route. So even if it was a case that dogs could see scents, they're not likely to, it's not going to be like a human seeing a
Yeah.
scent, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean. And it's interesting about the scent thing, because I tell everyone this, I have a real strong reaction to certain scents, perfumes, sort of synthetic scents. I can smell something like that and then I'll instantly get a headache,
Right.
So it shows you just how quick, even I suppose in us with our limited abilities, but how quickly there is a reaction to something that's out with our bodies,
Yeah.
So, and of course, we've got the same with hearing, haven't we, and taste. Some things that, I might find a pleasurable, taste. Someone else would, I can't possibly taste that. So it's that subjective, personal, and I know we're going to come on to that, but it's that subjective, personal, then interpretation, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
not just like information coming in and then processed a particular way. And you mentioned how the dog feels about it, or how they respond to that particular scent or movement, or whatever. So when it comes to dogs eyesight, I always think that's really interesting that, people will say, I was walking towards my dog and my dog didn't even realize it was me until I
Mhm.
got quite close. But that's right, isn't it? Dogs actually are not, they're not as good at detail further away unless
Yeah.
something's moving and then they notice the movement.
And may not be prioritizing what they're seeing versus what they're smelling, what they're hearing. One of the interesting things is when I observe my husband training dogs to track, because you see the dogs follow the track absolutely to the letter. And it might be so the other day we were training a couple with their dog. So the dog knows both people. One person's handling, the other person's hidden, like, I mean, it's probably about a quarter of a mile away. So the dog knows that they're following the scent of their owner. And presumably on some level knows that they're going to keep following the scent of the owner until they find the owner. Was not at all interested in finding the owner. Went straight past the owner. And then when we talked about it afterwards, the owner said, well, that's because I went up there to see if I could hide behind the bush. But then I came back and just like hid here. So the dog actually saw the owner and went straight past them, but without any flicker of acknowledgement, and
Mhm.
just kept following the scent. And you quite often see that with man trailing, also, anyone who does man trailing, that they'll get to the end and it's almost like, yeah, no, not interested in that. Just keep smelling.
Ah,
Um, so it's about what's going to give them the most important information. And I guess for us, we're obsessed with people's faces, aren't we? We're looking
yes.
for their facial recognition. We're looking for, how I don't know. I mean, in that instance, I might be looking to see, do they look cold? Do they look, do they look annoyed that I've taken so long to find them? Do they look happy that I found them? So it's like our human need to kind of judge what that social interaction is going to be like is very much based on visual information, the
Mm.
facial expression. Um, but in that situation, I would be quite happy if I didn't have a sense of smell because I don't use it at all there. Whereas for the dog, it's completely different. And you see that very obviously because you would imagine that they would go running up to their person going, "Hi, found
Found
you."
you.
Actually, it's not that at all. Some of them actually look disappointed because the trail has gone cold and they're still sniffing around trying to pick up where it might go next. So yeah, I think you're right. Trying to interpret a dog's experience of their senses is a lot of kind of projection and guessing work to a large extent. Um, and it is really interesting when we're observing our dogs without any requirement for them to act in a certain way to see what they do find interesting and what what will cause them to kind of move from one spot to another. Is it a smell? Is it what they see? Is it what they hear, etc.? How do they respond to what they hear differently depending on whether there's a nice smell there or not? All of those things are about prioritization and integration, which logically is very different in dogs than it is in people because they live in a different world to us.
Absolutely. And I think when I'm doing the sessions with dogs, the hardest part is to ask the human not to get involved particularly and just to observe and not direct them, not ignoring them either, but not sort of what humans quite often do is go over towards something that they want the dog to go and investigate. And so the dog will, come over because they're
Yeah.
used to doing that. And I think when I've watched them, being able to just move freely and decide what they want to go and find out about, um, their humans are quite often really shocked because they would say to me, my dog won't be interested in that. They won't go near that. They'll be up on that. They'll be doing this. And there's not been one case where the human has been right
Yeah.
because it's all about when the dog's been given cues to and interact with something or whatever. So the good thing about it for I think for humans is actually when you watch the dog exploring, doing their own thing, using their senses without us having a goal in mind. We're
Hmm.
not trying to get them to find a thing. We're not trying to get them to notice something. We're not introducing noise to a noise sensitive dog in the hope
Yeah.
that they'll habituate to it. We're not doing any of that. We're just saying, here are opportunities. And what's interesting is in the beginning, when the dogs go in, some dogs, they'll come in and they'll go straight to one object, off to the right or whatever. Other dogs go in and they have to go around the whole place first and they have to
Right.
explore all the way around. Um, Other ones will go to set things, and once they've kind of been to the set things, then they'll go further afield. But there are those who I think have been involved in a lot of training and a
Hmm.
lot of activities who stand and don't move because they're waiting for a release cue or they're
Right.
waiting for an instruction to go and do a thing.
Yeah.
And so they just sort of stand there, waiting. And actually, when we just sort of take a couple of steps to try and start the dog to think it's okay to move, um, you'll quite often see those dogs as well. They'll go off and investigate, but then they come back and check in with their owner. And
Yeah.
then they'll go and investigate and they'll come back and they'll check in. And so when you're looking at, when you're looking at this exploration, I think because it is natural, people think that, oh, if they've got the chance to go off and sniff, they'll just automatically take it.
Hmm.
But some of them don't straight away. But others, I'm sure it's more a case of saying, well, I need to find out about this whole area before I can relax into anything. And that's what you were saying, because it just struck me there as well. That's what you were saying about what's the priority for the dog
Yeah.
in that moment in time. The priority could be that they want to feel that it's safe to explore before
Yeah.
they get really involved. What I've seen is the dogs who tend to be a little nervous of other dogs. I usually have used dog blankets and things that I just hang up on the
Oh,
fence.
yeah.
The dogs that are worried about other dogs will go straight to those blankets first.
Right. That makes
And
sense. Yeah.
so that's a really interesting thing about watching the choices that they make, isn't it? And about the processes that are going through their brain, but at the same time not having that relying on instruction, which is quite difficult if you have done lots and lots with your dog and it's been around coming back to me,
Yeah.
being close to me. And actually, I've noticed a few dogs that find that quite stressful. That if
Yeah.
they're not getting sort of instruction from their human, they seem quite agitated, quite worried about it. And it takes them a little more time. So there's something that's, I guess it's kind of almost in a way overriding all of
Hmm.
that sensory information that they are still getting it, aren't they? It's not like they're not getting it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But even that can override what should be important to the dog
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, definitely. And past learning history is definitely so important. we see this even with dogs that are trained to use their senses. So dogs that are trained to do scent work or scent detection, if they come from an agility background, which is really relying on visual information and auditory information, they have to be able to process visual and auditory information at a very fast speed because they've got to be able to keep an eye on the body language of the handler, the objects that they're going to be navigating, whether it's over or, across or whatever. And then listening for what instructions their handler is giving them as well. So that's very different to prioritizing the olfactory world. And we see the same maybe cautiousness or anxiety, and that kind of, I don't really know what to do unless you're telling me what to do because I'm used to being told what to do. And it's a different skill set. It's a different skill set from following instructions to, oh, okay, now I get to decide what I want to do and what my priority is. Is there any right? Is there any wrong? Or do I just have a look around? So it's not necessarily good, bad, or ugly. It's just really interesting to
Yeah.
watch how we we sort of hone different skill sets depending on what the lifestyle of the dog is, and then we see how that has impacted their kind of free exploration and foraging when they're actually not given any goals.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons as well that I don't really like using food during the sessions
Right.
because the presence of food changes the dog's attention, to anticipating, is there food coming? You have food, so will you give it to me? And then what they'll sometimes do is go through that routine of rewarded behaviors. So they'll do a nice
Yeah.
sit, they'll do a down, they'll do all sorts of amazing tricks to try and like, I'm here, give me the food, give me the food. And
Yeah.
of course, there's that universal hand signal, isn't there, of the person with their hands in their pockets, that the dog just goes, hands in pockets, that must mean food. I'm
Yeah.
sticking beside you. But that increased attention
Hmm.
then on the presence of food, the anticipation of food, even if they're not given it, is why I don't like food being used during the sensory sessions. We generally at the end of the session would give them a chew to
Hmm.
finish on, but we don't use food at all and don't bring food in with us. There have been some dogs that we've introduced a little bit of food when they have been very, used to being very excited over food, and we've gradually introduced it here and there, but by and large, no food at all, because that becomes the sole focus and attention. And
Yeah.
that way, we're defeating the purpose of the session if we're
Yeah.
keeping attention on us rather than that exploration. And I think that was one of the questions that I had for you is about this idea of self-directed exploration and why it's really important that dogs do get opportunities to do that. Why exploring at your own pace, especially from this idea of processing all that information, why that would be important to sort of a dog's resilience, to their
Mhm.
sense of well-being. Um, so really from that point of view, the brain obviously is getting all of that information. Um, and yeah, there's going to be, personal preferences about what the dog finds interesting or not. But being able to slow down enough and
Yeah.
actually take the pressure off of them to say, just go and take in your world
Yeah.
and do what you're actually designed to do without expectations is quite hard, isn't it? For the few humans, anyway, it's quite hard.
Yeah, it's definitely hard for us because we live our lives generally being goal driven to a greater or lesser extent. Um, it is really interesting just to rewind slightly on the same subject because it's a very different experience, a very different experience for the brain, a neurological experience, whether there's food or not food, because food does automatically introduce a goal. The goal is find the food, and it's a well-known pattern for dogs, for some people as well, but for dogs definitely, that's a well-known pattern. The goal is find food. I will do whatever it takes to find food. So the brain is in a particular state, one of goal-directed motivation, which automatically it's a bit like an algorithm, if you like. It automatically downgrades some sensory information. So, for instance, the brain is much less likely to process tactile information whilst it's in a goal-directed motivation uh, phase, or I don't know what you would call it, that kind of state, brain state, because the tactile information is much less important. It's important to know if you tread on something painful, because that might be leading to injury, and then you would need to do something about that. But in terms of whether you're walking on wet grass or dry grass, or, yeah, I mean that's probably a good enough example. You don't need that level of detail because you're still going to be able to find food regardless of that. If you're not in that goal directed state, which let's remember that goal directed state of brain state is one that we harness as humans for our dogs when we want them to do dog sports, when we want them to do a job, when we want them to be operational, whatever it is, we want that goal directed state. But if we allow them to be able to explore without there being the goal of finding food, so without there being any learning associated with food in that environment, it is a completely different brain state. And what you will then get is a much higher proportion of the relaxation brain waves. So, there are two frequencies of brain waves that are associated with relaxation and ultimately with sleep. And you'll get a higher percentage. So, we've always got mixed brain waves going on. I mean, someone like me all the time, and sometimes it's chaos in my brain. Dogs probably have slightly less chaotic mixtures of brainwaves, but there are always some different frequencies. But those relaxation frequencies will predominate when there isn't goal-directed behavior. And you can see that. I was thinking this morning, I saw that really clearly with the Pointer and the Weimaraner when I took them out for a walk, because at one point, we were just walking along quite relatively relaxed. They're, hunt point retrieve dogs. They're never relaxed, but relatively so. They're running at 20 miles an hour instead of 30 miles an hour. And then all of a sudden, they both went into frenzy. Why? Because one of them had caught the scent of a rodent, and in a split second, that completely changed the walk to goal-directed brain state. And at that point, they're not really processing any tactile information to the consciousness. They're not processing auditory stimulation. I can scream at them all I like, but they don't really hear me. It's not that they're choosing to ignore me. It's just that the brain says, she is not going to help you find that rodent. So you might as well just block her out. So it's a very different way that the brain is processing information. So if we truly want to be able to build resilience and to be able to impact the HPA axis, which is this anatomical axis that releases adrenaline and cortisol, the research shows us that we need to be able to be in that relaxed state, and we need to be able to promote those brainwave frequencies that are associated with relaxation, because the goal-directed brain state has a different impact long term on our HPA axis. It's actually, in most cases, going to have the opposite effect, because you usually need loads of adrenaline and cortisol to be able to find the rodent. But if you're just like chilling out and wandering around and taking in all the senses, then you want to be able to decrease the activity of the HPA axis. But more importantly than that, because that's just about, whether you feel arousal in the moment, it's about changing the connections within the HPA axis so that ultimately you get more control over that physiological cascade and that physiological process. That's why I'm so passionate about building resilience, because one of the biggest impacts of building resilience is that greater level of control over those physiological cascades. So it doesn't mean that you don't get stressed. It doesn't mean that you don't get aroused. It doesn't mean that you don't get really high, I don't mean high as a kite as in drugs. I mean just like, I'm
Yeah.
excited. But what it does mean is that you have a greater level of control over that internal control so that you can really fine tune that. And therefore, your expression of that is appropriate and proportional, and you don't lose your head. It's how I describe it when I'm working with dogs is, oh, he's lost his head. It doesn't matter what we do now. He's just woo. And that's just showing that I haven't put the work in beforehand to build resilience and build that ability to have the internal emotional regulation and arousal regulation. Going back to, the important point is one of the activities that builds that is being able to create that brain state associated with those kind of what we would call slower brainwave frequencies, which are about self-directed foraging, about non-goal directed activities. And for some dogs, that is incredibly hard. I'm thinking particularly of the really high performing sports dogs to create a brain state that isn't goal directed, arguably to them feels like a waste of time.
Yeah.
And it parallels, I think, our urbanized living as humans. I know that I am still changing physiologically from, this time last year when I was in a full-time job, very goal directed. Every moment of my life had to either be working, thinking about work, which wasn't very productive, or trying not to think about work and trying to relax. But physiologically, I am still changing a year later, having, really changed my lifestyle, and I don't work in that way anymore. And hopefully, touch wood, won't need to again. And I'm finding now that, my sleep patterns are still changing, and my emotional control and control of my HPA axis, control of my arousal levels is still changing associated with that. That's a year later, a year after giving up a goal-directed lifestyle. Um, so yeah, I think some dogs will find it very hard and some dogs won't. Nancy, who you've met, usually finds it very easy to disconnect from anything that's anyone else's goal. I'm not saying she doesn't have her own goals, I don't know, but she definitely finds it easy to disconnect from anyone else's goal. Whereas Zebedee, my pointer, would find it much harder because he is much more used to being directed. And he's either intensely self-employed after rodents or intensely kind of goal directed from me. So I have had to work quite actively on his ability to relax and his ability to disconnect, if you like. I guess it's like what we would call disconnecting for humans, go out into nature and just disconnect and connect with
Absolutely.
natural rhythms. And on the brainwave frequency conversation, I've been looking at things like forest bathing,
Mhm.
which is this practice where you go into the forest and you surround yourself with the sensory information that you find in the forest, and you completely bathe yourself in that. Some people are able to do it in the way that they're able to create a meditative state. I find it very difficult to create a meditative state internally. I'm always writing a shopping list or remembering something that I forgot to do last week. But the forest bathing isn't necessarily about creating that meditative state, but it is about connecting with the rhythm of nature. And I've tried that a couple of times because we've got really ancient woodland with really ancient, whirlpools and things just next to the property. And it's actually quite an intense whole body experience to realize that most of the time, the frequency that my brain was functioning at was much, much higher than that of nature.
Mm.
And it was quite an emotional experience for me to kind of acknowledge that and realize that. And that was, one of the big drivers for the change in my lifestyle was, hang on a minute, this doesn't sound logical. I'm a neuroscientist and I know that that can't be good for our nervous systems. There's a very obvious neuroeconomic benefit. So, I will need to burn less energy, burn less glucose. I will be less tired if I can get more in tune with nature and nature's frequencies. And when I actually paid attention to them, it was very obvious to me that they were a lot slower than that my brain had got to in the kind of high stress jobs I was doing. So yes, I'm
Yeah.
probably going off at a tangent,
No,
but
no,
we did
no.
say we would do that.
No, it's fine. Actually, in the book, to help people understand about what an engage the senses session might look like, for some people, it's quite an easy link to think about mindfulness in
Yeah,
humans. And we do know, don't we, that for humans anyway, we can go for a walk through the forest or we can go through a walk in the countryside and take in not one bit of information. And
yeah,
it's not really doing us much good apart from maybe aerobic exercise or something. But if you stop and you notice things, so you listen to the birds, you listen to the noises that are in the background. You actually start to pay attention. That's where I think it's been proven that that has a more positive mental health
yeah,
benefit is when you notice. So to me, the engage the senses things for the dogs, it's not such a huge leap to say, but if they start to notice what is in their environment, that there's a great possibility that they then feel the benefit. Whereas if we take them for a run through the woods, a race along the beach,
yeah,
I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but if we're only doing that, we're not giving them the opportunity to actually tap into what's going on around us. Now, I see this a lot in dogs when people have got hyper dogs, and the example, one of the case studies I talk about is a dog, it's a border collie actually. And our owner was really struggling with her. And everyone kept saying, more activity, get her tired out, keep her brain busy, don't let her, absolutely bombard this dog with activity. Um, and she would do all that. And then the lady had to sit. She won't mind me saying this. The lady had to sit with a tennis ball while she was watching the TV and throw the tennis ball out into the
right.
hall. It was the only way that she could get peace to watch a television program. But she was doing more and more and more and more activity with focused activity with this dog. And actually, the problem wasn't that the dog was bored or not getting enough exercise. It was actually that the dog didn't ever get the other side. This
Yeah,
idea of being able to just slow things down, understand what it's like to actually, operate at a bit of a slower level. And that was really hard. And I see it a lot in, I've worked with a lot of rescues and dogs in kennels and rescues. And it's all about getting them out and doing stuff.
hmm,
Get them out of their kennel. They'll be bored in their kennel. Yeah, they are. But get them out, do stuff, and then put them back in.
yeah,
Um, and instead of, thinking about can we actually get them to be processing the information that's around them, is that going to be of more benefit ultimately than a dog who's used to human interaction is always around activity? So for lots of kennel dogs and dogs in rescue, the only time they're with the humans is when they're doing a thing.
hmm,
They're not experiencing being with humans and just going and settling down.
yeah,
So, there's that whole idea of what we as humans think that dogs need. And then when something goes wrong, because we're human, we automatically think, well, they must need more of that then.
Yeah,
And we just
yeah,
keep adding more and more in the hope that there will be an amount that absolutely changes, everything for dogs. And yet it isn't that. It's not more of the same that they
yeah.
need, is it?
Yeah, yeah. There's a really great ASPCA kennels in the States, which is like the equivalent for those who don't know to our RSPCA. And they have what they call an enrichment room. So their dogs might get time in an outside pen with ball throwing or whatever, but they make sure that all of them get enrichment time, which is it doesn't involve food because they found that that leads to too high arousal in a lot of the dogs, and some of the dogs have resource guarding issues with food. So it doesn't involve food, and it is just free exploration, foraging, etc. in the room. And someone does stay in the room with the dog, but they don't interact with the dog. So it's much more like a sensory session. It's as good as they can set up within
Yeah.
an indoor area in a kennels. And they contacted us to say that they'd done that as part of a sort of resilience building activity based on the article that Bobby and I wrote for IAABC, and that they'd noticed that it had really helped some of the dogs, but in very different ways. So some of the nervous dogs who were avoiding people were actually much more comfortable around people, even though they weren't directly addressing that. They're just giving them an opportunity to free forage. And then some of those dogs that had really high arousal and were very boisterous, what they were finding they weren't just calm during the sessions, but they're calm at other times as well. So that's speaking to what you were just saying about the fact that potentially we're allowing them to engage in an activity that is literally rewiring their brain. It is changing the way that their brain is processing information and allowing everything to slow down. And for some dogs, that slowing down is enabling them to then start building the skill sets and the confidence that they will need to, interact with people more or be in closer proximity with people. And for some dogs, that slowing down is about, oh, okay, so I don't need to run around like a crazy dog.
Mm.
Um, Arguably, both of those, they might be the different sides of the same coin in terms of a dog's response. It's entirely possible that some of those high arousal dogs were equally anxious about human social interaction, but they just dealt with it in a very different way. But it was really great to hear from them that they had seen benefits for all different types of dogs, and they weren't directly addressing those dogs' issues, quote unquote, what's written on as problem behaviors.
Mm.
Um, but just breaking up their days and giving them that opportunity, whether it's once a week or twice a week or whatever, was having a really positive impact. And they said that they didn't find a dog for whom it wasn't positive. Whereas, as you were saying, for some dogs, they were finding that turning them out, putting them into a pen and letting them run round actually wasn't benefiting them. They
Yeah.
weren't seeing an improvement in their problem behaviors, and they were seeing, a worsening of some of them, particularly the high arousal dogs for whom I think it's potentially for some of those quite stressful being turned out in a pen and left to your own devices
Mhm.
outside, surrounded by other dogs that are barking and other
Yeah.
stimuli, etc. And it's not that they weren't doing their absolute best. They're an amazing kennels, and they really put a lot of time, effort, and money into making sure that they can do their best. But yeah, that was one of the turning points for them, was realizing, like you say, oh, hang on a minute, we don't need to do more with a lot of these dogs. It's actually sometimes about doing less and
Mhm.
allowing them that time to process and make their own decisions, make their own choices, allowing them to choose, what they want to do and where they want to be.
Yeah, and I think one of the sort of last area that I was going to talk about was I had read about, and I included it in the book because I just thought it was really fascinating, is about the power of curiosity and what that actually does in terms of the brain as well. But this idea that being curious about something makes us feel really good, apart from anything. But that's different from, if a dog decides to go over and, oh, what is that? I'm going over to look. That's curiosity and practice. If I say, come and look at this and start pointing,
Yeah.
doesn't have the same benefit. And so to me, even just increasing the the idea of curiosity for dogs. So instead of, just being directed to go to something, having that mindset, a lot of fearful dogs are not curious because they have got that negative bias. They think, well, if I go near that, something really bad's going to happen to me.
Yeah.
That's a scary thing. But actually increasing opportunities without terrorizing dogs, but increasing opportunities where dogs can actually experience and feel good about curiosity and about going over and looking at something novel.
Mhm.
And that's why, a lot of the time you don't need special equipment, you don't need to spend lots of money, but something that is out of place that the dog hasn't habituated to sitting there, but moving it over there. It's maybe only minutes because then it becomes every day. But that curiosity of, oh, what is that? It's good for us as well. And I think that part of the thing I like about the Engage the Senses sessions is that I can start to see their owners, their humans becoming more curious about their dog
Yeah.
rather than thinking, he's not doing what I thought he would do. He's going to do terrible things that embarrass me. I bet you this is going to be a waste of money and my dog's not going to do anything. And, instead of having all of that rumbling around in their brain, they actually go, I wonder why he did that. Gosh, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. So to me, the sessions are beneficial, to us all. Every single session I do, I just think, that's really interesting. I don't need to have a meaning for it. I don't
Yeah.
actually need to explain why they did it. I just need to think, gosh, that's really interesting that I noticed that.
And it's quite unique to have a session where curiosity is the opportunities are available for curiosity, but there's no goal of curiosity. Because as you
Mm-mm.
said right at the beginning, if we say, oh, look at this, that has a completely different impact in terms of what's happening in the brain, how the brain's processing the information, what the dog feels about that, what the dog thinks about that. And whether that's of benefit in the direction of kind of, brain development and increasing the complexity of the brain wiring, etc. And I think one of the things that humans, and I put myself in this category as well, are very much guilty of is impatience.
Mm.
So if there's something new in the environment, and I know that I'm not supposed to go, hey, have a look at this. If the dog hasn't paid any attention to it, I'll be like, oh, you didn't see it. Maybe I just need to move it so it's more obvious. And yet, they always process everything in their environment, whether they choose to display behaviors to investigate that or not is a conscious choice. In the vast majority of cases, if not every single case, if the dog looks like it's ignoring something, it's ignoring it on purpose, as in we call it ignoring, but it's behaving that way on purpose. And so the idea that they can have access to an environment where curiosity is facilitated but not required means then they can be curious at their own pace
Mm.
with the stimuli that they want to prioritize. And it might mean that there's a particular object in that environment that they don't pay any attention to for the first two sessions. But on session three, they're like, oh, let me have a look at this.
Mm.
Whereas usually, and again, I'm putting myself in that category, we would kind of circumvent that by saying, oh, but you didn't have a look at that last time. Why don't you have a look at this
Yeah.
time? But if we're in a session where we know that, you know, we have to just hang back and be observant and just say, it's really interesting that he doesn't appear to have spent any time in that corner whatsoever. And that's okay. If he
Mhm.
never spends any time in that corner ever, that's okay.
Yeah.
And if he decides on session 6 to go and spend time in that corner, that's okay. But it's all about letting them do it at their own pace, at their own time, etc.
Yeah, and it is fascinating, to watch. And I think that for some dogs, I've got a play teepee, a wooden teepee that the dogs can go in. And it's funny because some dogs just charge in, have a look, probably lift their leg inside, Uh, but some go straight in. Others sort of give it a glance on the way past. Others, don't appear to notice it, but of course they do because it's a structure. You can't not notice it.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and it's really interesting because people go, "Oh, I love the teepee,"
yeah.
and it's almost like because they think that's cute and funny to have this wooden play teepee that they think that their dog should engage with it.
Yeah,
Because it's like, well, I've thought that's really cute and funny, and actually my dog's not even. And we will let them. We do take some photographs as we go around. Um, and I watch people with their phones, what they take photographs of. So I'm taking photographs of the gaps where the dog's not doing very much,
yeah.
but maybe is doing a bit of air scenting or is looking at something at a distance. So I'm taking my pictures at that. And the dog's humans are always taking photographs of when they engage with a piece of equipment
Yeah, yeah.
because that's what's important, to them.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
cute. That's a good photo opportunity. And I've had to stop people. I've got a nice ramp that the dogs can go up and over. And I've had to stop people from going over and standing casually beside the ramp
Right.
because they know their dog will go up and over it then.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's really, really, it's difficult for us.
Yeah, very. Yeah.
It's really hard.
I remember because I came to see your setup and I went, "Oh, TP."
I know. And, I know that we have to appeal to the humans as well. Because realistically, if you had a sort of big field and there wasn't much in it, and your dog went round and looked at things and sniffed things, they would still get a lot of benefit from that. The
Absolutely.
problem
Yeah.
is that lots of dogs see an empty field and the humans go on, have a good run.
Yeah,
Go
yeah,
on, or start throwing a ball or whatever. But a lot of the things that I have in my setup are designed to just provide opportunities. And that's what I keep saying to everyone. It's an opportunity. It's up to your dog whether they take it or not. If they do take it, that must be meaningful to them. If they
yeah,
don't take it, it doesn't really, we don't need to dwell on that. That doesn't matter. And it's trying to get through to people that we are just providing opportunities.
yeah.
And I think on the last thing I wanted to say, because I've kept you longer than I said I would, but the last thing I wanted to say is that, when we talk about enrichment, um, especially with dogs, it seems to have just gone down the route of finding food in various, methods and contraptions and
Goal
various
directed.
ways. Aha,
Yeah.
rather than saying enrichment is, there's lots of things that are enriching, aren't they? But
Hmm.
I, as an individual, decide what is enriching to me. You can't tell me what
Yeah.
is enriching. So when we look at the dog in that moment in time, they are making a choice about what they find interesting, what they
Yeah.
find enriching. And to me, I think that can only be of benefit to them. Um, whether people don't feel it's as valuable as getting their dog to do activities that you
Hmm.
can see and oh, my dog has learned how to do that. My dog will do that when I ask them to do it. Unfortunately, with all that you're explaining about how the brain processes, it's not really greatly visible to us the benefits are
Yeah.
not immediately visible to us. but to the
Yeah.
dog, it makes a massive difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, a huge difference. And it really is that difference between, the dog's brain is developing for anything up to, we don't know exactly, but 4 years, 4.5 years, probably very different in different breeds, but a lot longer than we used to think. We used to think they're kind of adult by 18 months old. They're slap bang in the middle of adolescence then. So the dog's brain is developing for the first few years of its life. And what is that development? How complex is that development? How what we would say heterogeneous is that development, which just means how many different experiences are feeding into that brain development. Because really, you want as many different experiences as the brain's developing, so that the dog has the ability to connect all the different brain areas and to be able to process information at different speeds for different priorities, to be able to have what will end up being behavioral flexibility and emotional regulation, or a high degree of, regulatory ability. Um, so it's really about enriching the dog's brain development and the maintenance of those connections within the dog's brain through the enriching experiences, rather than focusing only on learning, because that is one small portion of how the brain works. And if that's the majority of how the dog spends its time, then actually, in terms of brain development, it's relatively less enriched, because you can teach it to do different things, but you're still teaching it to do
Mm.
something. So it's still got the same goal-directed brain state associated with it. So I think, yeah, that I think that's probably a key difference in the way that I bring my dogs up now. I'm not saying my dogs are the perfect dogs by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm way less focused on them learning lots of different things to enrich them. And I'm completely convinced from the results that the learning for them is one way to um, entertain them, excite them, enrich their lives. But it really is just one way, and teaching them to do different things is still teaching them.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I love scent work, because it is much, even though there is still some goal direction associated with it, it is much more. It's an activity that involves much more agency and much more choice from the dog, which is nice. But yeah, I think it is really important to give them the freedom to be curious, to give them the freedom to be able to act or not act as they want. And some dogs might need a bit of help. I don't know if you've had really anxious dogs that sort of need a bit of support or a bit of guidance, just so that they feel more comfortable in the environment. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, quite often, I've had dogs here that I worry, almost like worried by the world, like anything
yeah,
at all that happens out with their very set routine can be really difficult. So, what I tend to ask the owners to do there as well is to gradually start introducing something different at home in their safe space. Just introduce one different thing that's out of place,
yeah.
rather than do a full session that completely overloads them. Um, I've also had dogs that, are not particularly human friendly.
Hmm.
Um, Now I can, because of the way I've got it set up, I can easily go through and be on the other side of a gate. So if the dog's uncomfortable with me, I don't need to even, be in with them. Um, but usually what happens in that case is that, the dog very quickly realizes, well, you're behind the gate. You're not coming in. You're not going to try and interfere with me, touch me, or talk to me. So they can relax a bit to go about and do their own thing. And then I just make sure that when they're ready to leave, I'm not standing at the gate.
Yeah.
And so what I've found with these dogs is I've opened up the sensory area to that dog and their owner without me needing to be there at all.
Hmm.
Um, but what I might start to do with them is, I might sort of appear now and again, but at a distance. The dog notices me, and now goes back to what they were doing. Whereas
Yeah.
before, a person appearing, and I'm talking about being away down the other end of the paddock, I wasn't really close, but somebody appearing in the environment would have set off a frenzy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
about not trying to distract them by making them engage with something, but actually having them relax enough that they are taking in another bit of information. And me arriving on the scene is just a small change in the environment.
Yeah.
It's not like the biggest thing that they have to notice. So
Yeah.
it's really, really interesting. Um, it's not like getting the dog to be searching for treats in the grass and then I appear and the dog's so fixated on the food that, oh, I see you, but I'm doing this. We
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
want that, because that isn't real life. If you're
Yeah.
out with a nervous dog, um, the chances are that somebody's just going to appear in the environment. Now, how the dog reacts to that additional sensory bit of information, depends on lots of things, but we can start, to just allow the dogs to sort of say, well, yeah, there's something over there. It's not really important.
Yeah.
Whereas before, there's something over there was the important thing,
Yeah.
you
And
know.
I think it's really important also to recognize that the dog is learning something, or at least it's having an experience that it will go back to for future experiences. And that experience involves, I dealt with that perfectly well on my own. I didn't need to be told how to behave. It didn't get weird because I was being set up, because they always know when they're being
Yes.
set up. Um, it was fine. Like, person appeared, I had a look, decided to do something else. It all ended well. And again, I think that is a surprisingly unique set of circumstances for our dogs, because it is so easy for us as humans to focus on unwanted behavior and then to orchestrate how we want the dog to behave in those situations. But it is so important that their nervous system builds those connections and that structure that allows them to be the decision maker all the way through, in terms of to what degree do I process what's going on over there, and how do I behave, and what position do I want my body to be in, etc. And a lot of that won't be conscious, because we don't process a lot of that consciously when we're in social situations. So there's no reason to think that dogs would process that consciously, but that is almost the point, is that it then creates the neuronal networks for that to be a subconscious choice, and the ability for the dog to respond in that way when it's out in the world and the circumstances are slightly different.
Mhm. And I think that's really important, isn't it? It's about allowing the dogs to do what they do naturally while being safe, while doing it in a way that it doesn't overwhelm them. Um, and just gradually, I always think about it, it's a bit like sort of starting off with a very small core, and then just ever so gradually increasing that so that other things can be within that core, but they're no longer a threat or frightening. The thing to remember, though, as far as I tell everyone is that come for the sessions, we are doing these sessions for the sake of the sessions. We're not doing it to introduce lots of people coming and
Yes.
reactive dogs then seeing them. That's not the point behind it. Then that becomes something else.
That's the setting up bit that all of our dogs clock straight away and go,
Yes,
okay, this is weird. I don't know why humans do it. It's weird behavior. I'm just going to have to roll with it. And,
yeah,
sometimes that goes well, sometimes that doesn't.
yes. So it's about doing it for the sake of doing it and recognizing that there is benefit to the dog, us having the benefit of getting to know our dogs a wee bit better, that we can actually see what they choose to do on that day. Tomorrow you'll do it again and they'll choose something else. And having that curiosity about their abilities and how they use that and how they see their own world. And as I say, I see lots of posts on Facebook, and it's all about dogs having to live in our world and us introducing it, and for them to have to learn about our world. Of course they do. We have to learn that there are social norms and we can't just do whatever we like whenever we want, sadly. Um, but yeah, there is a degree of learning about how to navigate a world. But that's a different world to where the dog actually is and what
Yeah,
they see as their world. And I think we don't give enough attention to understanding that they see the world in a particular way that should spark our curiosity, not that we immediately go, we need to adjust that dog to fit in this environment. Uh,
yeah,
and I think that someone asked me once, is this all about just keeping the dogs calm and not being, dogs not being allowed to be ever excited? And I think that was a brilliant question, because my book does talk a lot about calming everything down so that the dog can take stuff in. It's not about saying the dogs can't ever get excited or they can't go for a run on the beach or they can't enjoy other things, but just make sure that this side of things is not neglected because
yeah,
we prefer that side.
yeah,
We think fun is our dog running up and down and having a whale of a time. We don't seem to recognize that this bit over here is also fun and
yeah.
is also a necessity. So I think I've kept you for ages. I'm really sorry.
No,
And
you're
it's
very welcome.
absolutely amazingly fascinating. If people want to get in touch with you or find out more about what you do, how would they
Uh,
go about that?
Barking Brains on Facebook. I've had a website in development forever and it's no nearer, so it may never happen. I would just go to Facebook and look for Barking Brains. If you're in Scotland, I am in Scotland, so I practice at Two Rivers and see behaviour cases, but otherwise, yep, through Facebook.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm sure it's going to open up lots and lots of questions for people. But again, we want that it just sparks that curiosity to find out a little more about our dogs and their amazing brains, let's be honest.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
thank you.
You're very welcome.